The boardroom was silent except for the soft hum of the air conditioning, when my youngest brother Marcus cleared his throat and said, "Well, since we're all here, maybe it's time we address the elephant in the room." I looked up from the quarterly reports I'd been reviewing, my reading glasses perched on my nose, completely unprepared for what came next. "We've been talking, and honestly, Bessie, we think you're the most useless member of this family. All you do is sit in meetings and pretend you understand business while the rest of us do the real work. Before I tell you what happened next, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." The words hit me like ice water. I sat there, my hands still holding the financial documents that showed Franklin Industries had just posted its most profitable quarter in company history, and watched as my 3 brothers and 2 sisters nodded in agreement around the mahogany table that had belonged to our grandfather. My sister Catherine leaned forward, her manicured fingers drumming against the wood. "Marcus is right. You inherited everything from Dad. But what have you actually contributed? We're the ones running the divisions, making the deals, building relationships. You just show up and collect the checks." I removed my glasses slowly, setting them down next to the papers with hands that weren't quite steady. These were the people I'd built my entire life around, the family I protected and provided for, through every crisis and celebration for the past 15 years since our father's death. I looked at each of their faces, searching for some sign that this was a cruel joke, but all I saw was cold certainty. My brother James, the one I'd bailed out of his gambling debts 3 times, was nodding along. My sister Patricia, whose daughter's medical bills I'd quietly covered for years, wouldn't even meet my eyes. My name is Bessie Franklin, and at 68 years old, I thought I knew exactly who I was and where I belonged in this world. I was the eldest of 6 children, born into a family that had built Franklin Industries from a small textile mill in North Carolina into a global manufacturing empire worth over $2 billion. When our father, Samuel Franklin, passed away 15 years ago, he left me controlling interest in the company, along with the family estate and the responsibility of keeping our sprawling, complicated family together. I'd never married, never had children of my own. The company and my siblings had been my life's work, my purpose, my legacy. Every decision I made was filtered through one simple question: what's best for the family? When Marcus wanted to expand into overseas markets but lacked the capital, I approved the loan from company funds. When Catherine's husband left her with massive credit card debt, I quietly transferred money to cover it. When James lost his house in a bad investment, I bought him a new one and put it in his name. When Patricia's marriage fell apart and she needed support while going back to school, I made sure she had everything she needed. I thought I was being a good sister, a responsible family matriarch. I thought they appreciated the stability I provided, the way I kept the company profitable, while giving them the freedom to pursue their own interests within the business. I thought we were a team. I was wrong about everything. The conversation in that boardroom had been building for months, though I'd been too naive to see the signs. It started with small things. Marcus would make decisions about his division without consulting me, then present them as fait accompli in meetings. Catherine began scheduling client dinners and important presentations when she knew I had other commitments, then would mention casually that I'd missed another important discussion. James started referring to his department as if I had no say in its operations, despite the fact that I'd personally hired half his staff and approved every major initiative. I'd attributed their behavior to growing confidence, to them finally feeling comfortable taking ownership of their roles. I'd been proud of their independence, proud that they felt secure enough to take initiative. I thought it meant I'd done a good job as their leader and their sister. Instead, they'd been systematically undermining my authority while building a case that I was unnecessary. The meeting that day had been called under the pretense of discussing our Q3 results and planning for the next fiscal year. I'd arrived early, as always, with detailed reports on every aspect of our operations. I'd spent the previous weekend reviewing personnel files, analyzing market trends, and preparing recommendations for strategic improvements. I thought I was doing my job. They thought I was wasting everyone's time. "The truth is," Patricia said, her voice taking on that patronizing tone she'd perfected over the years, "you don't really understand the modern business world, Bessie. You're stuck in Dad's way of doing things. The company would run better if those of us who actually understand the market had more control." My brother David, who'd been silent until then, finally spoke up. "We've already talked to the lawyers about restructuring the leadership. It's time for you to step back and let us handle things. You can keep your shares, keep drawing your dividends, but the day-to-day operations need fresh blood." I felt something cold settle in my chest. They hadn't just criticized my performance, they'd already taken steps to remove me from the company our father had entrusted to my care. They'd gone behind my back, met with attorneys, made plans for my future without including me in the conversation. The betrayal was so complete, so calculated, that for a moment I couldn't find words. "You want me to step down," I said finally, my voice sounding strange in my own ears. "We want the company to succeed," Marcus replied smoothly, "and that means putting the right people in charge. People who understand technology, who can build relationships with younger clients, who can move fast when opportunities arise." Catherine nodded emphatically. "We're not trying to hurt you, Bessie. We're trying to save the business. Franklin Industries can't afford to be run like it's still 1950. I looked around the table at these 5 people I'd devoted my life to supporting, and realized they'd already made their decision. This wasn't a discussion, it was a notification. They'd spent months, maybe years, planning this moment, and they'd invited me here not to participate in the decision but to be informed of it. The strangest part was how reasonable they all sounded. They weren't screaming or throwing accusations. They spoke in measured tones, like adults having a difficult but necessary conversation. They made their arguments with charts and graphs and market analysis, as if the problem was purely professional and not deeply, devastatingly personal. But underneath their professional language, I heard something else. I heard years of resentment. Years of feeling overshadowed by the sister who'd inherited what they believed should have been shared equally. I heard frustration at having to answer to someone they'd apparently never respected. Most of all, I heard the comfortable certainty of people who'd convinced themselves they were doing the right thing. "I see," I said, and stood up from the table. My legs felt unsteady, but I managed to walk to the window that looked out over the factory floor where our grandfather had once worked alongside his employees. 3 generations of Franklins had built this company through depression and war, through economic booms and recessions, through every challenge the modern world had thrown at them. And now these 5 people wanted to push me aside because they'd decided I was dead weight. "Bessie," James said, and I heard something that might have been guilt in his voice. "This doesn't change anything between us as a family. We're still your brothers and sisters. We still love you." I turned back to face them, and I think something in my expression made Catherine shift uncomfortably in her chair. "Do you?" I asked quietly. "Because people who love me wouldn't spend months plotting behind my back. People who love me wouldn't call me useless in a room full of company executives." "We're being honest," Patricia said, her chin lifting defensively. "Someone had to say it. You've been coasting for years, Bessie. Dad left you in charge because you were the oldest, not because you were the most qualified." The words hung in the air like a physical presence. I felt them settle into my bones, into the places where I'd carried doubt about my own abilities for decades. Part of me wanted to argue, to pull out the financial reports that showed how well the company had performed under my leadership, to remind them of every crisis I'd navigated, every opportunity I'd recognized and pursued. But another part of me, the part that had been their big sister long before I was their boss, just felt tired. "I understand," I said, and I picked up my glasses and my papers. "Thank you for your honesty." Marcus looked surprised. "So you'll consider stepping back?" I didn't answer him directly. Instead, I walked to the door and paused with my hand on the handle. "I need some time to think about what you've said today." "Of course," Catherine said, and she actually smiled, like she thought the hard part was over. "Take all the time you need. We know this is a big adjustment." I left the boardroom and walked through the executive offices, where I'd spent 15 years making decisions that affected hundreds of employees and millions of dollars in revenue. My assistant, Mrs. Rodriguez, looked up from her computer as I passed, and I could tell from her expression that she'd heard at least part of what had happened. Word traveled fast in a company this size, especially when it involved family drama at the highest levels. "Mrs. Franklin," she said softly, "is there anything you need?" I stopped at her desk and looked down at this woman who'd been my right hand for over a decade, who knew my schedule better than I did, who'd helped me manage every aspect of the business with quiet efficiency and absolute loyalty. Actually, yes, I said. I need you to schedule a meeting with Richard Morrison for tomorrow morning. Tell him it's urgent. Richard Morrison was our family attorney, the man who'd handled my father's estate and every legal matter Franklin Industries had faced since. If my siblings wanted to restructure the company leadership, they'd need his help to do it properly. But there were some things about my father's will and the company's legal structure that I'd never shared with them, details that Richard and I had kept confidential for very good reasons. Mrs. Rodriguez nodded and made a note in her planner. Of course. Anything else? Yes, I said, and I felt something shift inside me, something that had been dormant for too long. I need you to pull all the records on loans, gifts, and financial support I've provided to family members over the past 15 years. Everything. Every bailout, every covered expense, every favor.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
I want a complete accounting. Her eyebrows rose slightly, but she simply nodded. I'll have that ready for you by end of business today. I thanked her and continued to my office, closing the door behind me for the first time in months. I sat behind the desk my father had used, looking out at the city he'd helped build through his business and philanthropy, and tried to process what had just happened. The people I'd loved most in the world had just told me I was worthless. They'd dismissed 15 years of my leadership as irrelevant. They'd made plans for my future without consulting me, as if I were an obstacle to be managed rather than a person to be respected. But more than the hurt, more than the shock, I felt something else building inside me. For the first time in my adult life, I felt truly free. Free from the obligation to consider their feelings before my own. Free from the responsibility to protect them from the consequences of their choices. Free from the need to be the good sister, the reliable matriarch, the one who always put family first. They wanted to know what I was worth to the company. They were about to find out what the company was worth without me. They thought I was useless. They were about to discover exactly how useful I'd been, and exactly what they'd lose when I was gone. I opened my desk drawer and pulled out a file I'd hoped I'd never need to use. Inside were documents Richard had prepared years ago. Contingency plans my father had insisted on, including in his estate planning. Samuel Franklin had been a shrewd businessman who understood family dynamics better than his children had ever realized. He'd structured his will and the company's ownership in ways that protected both the business and the family from exactly the kind of power struggle that had just played out in the boardroom. My siblings thought they understood their inheritance, but they knew the terms of their father's will. They were wrong about that too. They'd focused on the shares they'd received, the money they'd inherited, the positions they'd been granted in the company. They'd never paid attention to the fine print, the conditions and stipulations that gave me far more control than they realized. I spent the rest of that afternoon reading through documents I'd studied countless times over the years, refreshing my memory on clauses and provisions that were about to become very important. By the time Mrs. Rodriguez knocked on my door with the financial records I'd requested, I had a clear picture of what I was dealing with and what my options were. The numbers she'd compiled were staggering, even to me. Over the past 15 years, I'd provided my siblings with over $12 million in direct financial support, not counting the generous salaries they'd drawn from the company or the benefits they'd received as board members. Marcus alone had received $3 million to cover his failed business ventures and personal debts. Catherine had cost me nearly $2 million in divorce settlements and lifestyle support. James's gambling problems had required constant intervention, totaling almost $4 million in loans that had never been repaid. But the money was just the beginning. I'd used company resources to solve their problems, company connections to advance their careers, company reputation to smooth over their mistakes. When Patricia's son was arrested for drug possession, I'd hired the best lawyers in the state and made sure the story stayed out of the media. When David's wife had been caught embezzling from her previous employer, I'd quietly paid restitution to avoid prosecution and found her a position in our company where she could be monitored. I'd been their safety net, their problem solver, their silent partner in every crisis. And they'd repaid that loyalty by deciding I was expendable. That evening, I drove home to the family estate, a sprawling property on the outskirts of Charlotte that had been in our family for 3 generations. The house itself was a testament to Franklin's success, a colonial mansion with 20 rooms, formal gardens, and enough land to ensure complete privacy. It had been my sanctuary for 15 years, the place where I retreated from the pressures of business to think and plan and remember who I was beyond my role as CEO. As I pulled into the circular driveway, I noticed Marcus's car parked near the front entrance. Through the windows, I could see lights on in the main parlor, and I realized my siblings had continued their meeting here, in the house where we'd grown up, making plans for my future in the rooms where our father had raised us to respect and support each other. I sat in my car for a long moment, debating whether to go inside and confront them or simply drive to one of the hotels I owned downtown. But this was my house, my property, my sanctuary. If they wanted to plot against me, they could do it somewhere else. I walked through the front door and heard their voices immediately. They were in the parlor, as I'd suspected, their conversation animated and confident. I could smell the whiskey they'd helped themselves to from my father's collection, could hear the comfortable laughter of people who believed they'd won. "She took it better than I expected," Catherine was saying as I approached the doorway. "I thought she'd put up more of a fight." "Bessie's always been practical," Marcus replied. "She knows when she's beat. Give her a few days to process, and she'll go along with the restructuring. She doesn't really have a choice." I stepped into the doorway, and the conversation stopped abruptly. They all turned to look at me, and I saw a flicker of guilt cross several faces before it was quickly masked. "Don't stop on my account," I said calmly. "Please, continue your discussion about my future." Patricia set down her glass and stood up. "Bessie, we were just planning how to divide up my company," I finished. "Yes, I gathered that. Tell me, have you also discussed how you plan to repay the millions of dollars I've loaned each of you over the years? Because if I'm stepping down as CEO, I assume you'll want to settle those debts." The room went very quiet. David cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Those weren't loans, Bessie. That was family helping family." "Was it?" I asked. "Because I have detailed records of every transaction, every bailout, every time I've cleaned up your messes. My accounting department has been very thorough." James shifted in his chair, looking less confident than he had a few hours earlier. "You're being petty now. That money was given freely." "Given to family members who supposedly respected and valued me," I replied. "But since you've made it clear that I'm useless to you, I see no reason to continue providing that support." Marcus stood up, his face flushing with anger. "You can't retroactively turn gifts into loans just because your feelings are hurt." I smiled at him, and something in my expression made him take a step back. "Actually, Marcus, I can do whatever I want. You see, there are some things about Father's will that you've never bothered to learn. Some provisions that give me considerably more power than you realize." The silence stretched out for a long moment. Then Catherine laughed, but it sounded forced. "You're bluffing. We know what the will says. We each inherited equal shares of the company stock." "You inherited shares," I agreed. "But those shares come with conditions. Conditions that our father insisted on, including specifically to prevent what happened in that boardroom today." I walked to the antique secretary in the corner and pulled out a copy of our father's will, the complete version that Richard had prepared. Not the simplified summary my siblings had received after the funeral. I'd kept this copy locked away for 15 years, hoping I'd never need to use it, but today had changed everything. "Section 12, subsection 4, I read aloud. "In the event that any beneficiary acts against the interests of the family unit or attempts to undermine the designated executor's authority, their inheritance shall be subject to forfeiture, as determined by the sole discretion of the primary beneficiary." Patricia's face had gone pale. "What does that mean?" "It means," I said, closing the document and looking at each of them in turn, "that your father knew exactly what kind of people you were, even 15 years ago. He knew you might try to push me aside, and he made sure I had the legal authority to stop you." The parlor erupted in voices, all of them talking at once, demanding explanations, making accusations, trying to reassert control over a situation that was slipping away from them. But I didn't listen to their words. Instead, I watched their faces, saw the exact moment when each of them realized that the balance of power hadn't shifted the way they'd thought. "This is ridiculous," Marcus said finally, his voice rising above the others. "You can't disinherit us over one conversation. We're your family." "Yes," I said quietly. "You are. And this afternoon, my family told me I was worthless. My family voted me the most useless member. My family spent months planning to push me aside like I was some kind of obstacle to their success." I walked toward the door, then paused and turned back to face them one more time. "You wanted to know what I contribute to this family? Tomorrow, you're going to find out exactly what you lose when I'm gone." I left them there in the parlor, arguing among themselves, trying to figure out if I was serious, trying to determine what power they actually had. I went upstairs to my bedroom, locked the door, and called Richard Morrison at home. "Richard," I said when he answered, "I need to see you first thing in the morning. It's time to discuss those contingency plans my father insisted we prepare." There was a pause, then a sigh. "I wondered when this day would come," he said. "Samuel always said it would. I'll clear my schedule." After I hung up, I sat on the edge of my bed and looked around the room where I'd slept for 15 years, surrounded by family photos and mementos of a life devoted to people who'd just proven they'd never valued me at all. For the first time since my father's funeral, I felt like I could see clearly. They thought they'd won today. They thought they'd successfully maneuvered me into a corner where I'd have no choice but to accept their decision. They thought I was too old, too set in my ways, too dependent on their approval to fight back. They were wrong about that, too. By tomorrow evening, they were going to understand exactly how wrong they'd been about everything. Richard Morrison's law office occupied the top floor of the tallest building in downtown Charlotte, a testament to the success he'd built representing North Carolina's wealthiest families for over 3 decades. When I arrived at 8 o'clock sharp the next morning, his secretary immediately ushered me into his private conference room, where Richard was already waiting with several thick files spread across the polished table. He stood when I entered, his silver hair impeccably styled as always, his expression grave but unsurprised. We'd known each other since I was a teenager, and he'd guided me through every major legal decision of my adult life. He'd been my father's closest advisor and had become mine after Samuel's death. If anyone understood the full scope of what I was facing, it was Richard. "Bessie," he said, gesturing for me to take a seat across from him. "I have to say, I've been expecting this call for years. Your father predicted this exact scenario." I settled into the leather chair and accepted the coffee his secretary offered before she quietly closed the door behind her. "He knew they'd try to push me out?" Richard opened the largest file and pulled out a handwritten letter I recognized immediately. It was in my father's careful script, sealed in an envelope marked with my name and dated just 3 months before his death. "He knew his children better than they knew themselves," Richard said gently. "He understood their personalities, their weaknesses, their resentments. He also understood that you'd sacrifice everything for them, even if it meant sacrificing yourself." I stared at the letter, my hands trembling slightly as I reached for it. I'd known it existed but had hoped I'd never need to read it. My father had prepared several such documents, contingencies for various scenarios he'd anticipated might arise after his death. This one was labeled "In case of family insurrection." The letter was brief but devastating in its accuracy. Samuel Franklin had written it like a man who could see the future, predicting not just that my siblings would eventually turn against me, but exactly how they'd do it. He'd anticipated their arguments about my capabilities, their resentment of my inherited authority, their willingness to dismiss my contributions while claiming credit for the company's success. But more than predictions, the letter contained instructions. Detailed, specific instructions for how I should respond when this day came. My father hadn't just prepared legal safeguards. He'd prepared a complete strategy for protecting both the company and myself from the family we'd both devoted our lives to supporting. He watched them during the years before his death, Richard explained as I read. He saw how they treated employees, how they handled responsibility, how they reacted when they didn't get their way. He loved them, but he didn't trust them with his life's work. The letter outlined a series of legal mechanisms my father had built into his estate planning, provisions that went far beyond the simple inheritance my siblings understood. They thought they owned shares in Franklin Industries. What they actually owned were conditional beneficiary rights that could be revoked under specific circumstances, all of which had been triggered by their attempt to remove me from leadership. The most important thing to understand, Richard continued, pulling out another document, is that your father never actually transferred majority control to you through his will. You already owned 51% of Franklin Industries before he died. He purchased those shares for you secretly over a period of 10 years, using profits from investments he'd made in your name since you were 18. I looked up from the letter, stunned. I've owned controlling interest for 10 years? Longer than that, actually. Your father began transferring assets to you in small increments starting when you turned 21. He wanted to ensure that if anything happened to him, you'd have the resources to protect the company and the family. The inheritance your siblings received was essentially a gift you could have vetoed at any time. The implications of this revelation were staggering. For 15 years, I'd operated under the assumption that I'd inherited a responsibility I had to share with my siblings, that their input and approval were necessary for major decisions. In reality, I'd owned the company outright since before my father's death, and everything I'd done to accommodate their wishes had been voluntary. Why didn't he tell me? I asked. Richard's expression softened. Because he knew you'd never use that power against them unless you absolutely had to. He wanted you to learn leadership through consensus and collaboration, not through dominance. But he also wanted to ensure you'd have the tools to protect yourself if they ever forgot who they were dealing with. He handed me another file, this one containing detailed financial records I'd never seen before. This documents every loan, every bailout, every financial favor you've provided to your siblings over the past 15 years. Your father instructed me to maintain these records specifically for this purpose. Every transaction was structured as a loan, with specific terms for repayment, regardless of how you presented it to them at the time. I flipped through pages of legal documents, promissory notes, and accounting records. Every time I'd helped Marcus with his business ventures, every time I'd covered Catherine's debts, every time I'd bailed James out of trouble, my father's estate attorneys had documented it as a formal loan agreement. The total amount was even higher than I'd calculated, over $15 million, plus interest that had been accumulating for years. They owe me $15 million, I said, barely believing the words as they left my mouth. $15.7 million, as of yesterday, Richard corrected. And under the terms your father established, all loans become immediately due and payable if the borrowers act against your interests or attempt to remove you from company leadership. I set the documents down and stared across the conference table at the man who'd just turned my understanding of my entire adult life upside down. So when they voted me most useless yesterday, they triggered every fail-safe mechanism your father built into his estate plan, Richard finished. As of this morning, they're in default on $15.7 million in loans, their company shares are subject to forfeiture, and their employment with Franklin Industries can be terminated without cause or severance. The silence in the room was broken only by the soft ticking of the antique clock on Richard's bookshelf. I felt like I was seeing my family, my company, and my entire life through completely different eyes. My father hadn't just left me a business to run, he'd left me a chess game where I'd always held all the winning pieces, even when I didn't know it. There's more, Richard said gently. Your father also established a private trust that's been accumulating assets for 15 years. It's currently worth approximately $400 million, and it's entirely separate from Franklin Industries. Even if your siblings somehow managed to destroy the company, you'd still be one of the wealthiest women in North Carolina. I laughed, but it sounded strange and hollow in the quiet room. He really did think of everything, didn't he? Samuel Franklin didn't build a billion-dollar company by leaving things to chance, Richard replied. He understood that family dynamics could destroy a business faster than any economic downturn or competitive threat. He prepared for every contingency. We spent the next 2 hours going through every aspect of my father's plan. There were provisions for removing individual family members from the company while protecting the others. There were mechanisms for transferring their shares to a family trust that would provide them with income without giving them voting rights. There were even detailed instructions for how to handle the public relations aspects of a family dispute, including relationships with key clients and community leaders who needed to understand that Franklin Industries would remain stable regardless of internal changes. By the time we finished reviewing everything, I had a complete picture of my options. I could forgive their betrayal and continue operating as I had for 15 years, pretending they hadn't shown me exactly what they thought of me. I could remove them from company leadership while allowing them to keep their financial benefits. I could demand immediate repayment of their loans and force them to choose between bankruptcy and selling their shares back to me. Or I could exercise the nuclear option my father had prepared, complete disinheritance and removal from all family assets. What would you do? I asked Richard as we prepared to leave. He was quiet for a long moment, gathering the documents into neat stacks. Your father asked me the same question when we were drafting these provisions, he said finally. I told him then what I'll tell you now. The measure of a person isn't what they do when they're respected and appreciated. It's what they do when they're betrayed by the people they love most. I left Richard's office with copies of every document, every legal option, every tool my father had provided for this exact situation. But I also left with something else, a growing sense of anger that I'd been too shocked to feel the day before. My siblings hadn't just insulted me or questioned my abilities. They'd spent months, possibly years, planning to betray me while accepting my financial support and professional guidance. They'd called me useless while living off my generosity. They'd plotted to remove me from the company I'd built, while pretending to be loyal family members. The drive back to Franklin Industries gave me time to think about how I wanted to handle the confrontation that was coming. They'd be expecting me to arrive defeated, ready to negotiate the terms of my surrender. They'd probably prepared speeches about how this was all for the good of the company, how they'd make sure I was taken care of in my retirement, how nothing would change between us personally. They were in for a surprise. I parked in my reserved space and walked through the executive offices with a confidence I hadn't felt in years. Mrs. Rodriguez looked up from her computer as I approached, her expression carefully neutral. She'd been with the company long enough to recognize the signs of a family crisis, and she was too professional to show favoritism, even though I knew where her loyalties lay. Good morning, Mrs. Franklin, she said. Your siblings have been asking when you'd be in. They've scheduled a follow-up meeting for 10 o'clock. Have they? I said, and something in my tone made her look at me more carefully. Well, we wouldn't want to keep them waiting. Please ask them to join me in the boardroom immediately. And Mrs. Rodriguez? I'd like you to sit in on this meeting and take detailed notes. Her eyebrows rose slightly. In 15 years, I'd never asked her to document a family meeting. But she simply nodded and reached for her notepad. Of course. Within 10 minutes, all 5 of my siblings were seated around the same table where they'd humiliated me the day before. They looked relaxed, confident, like people who believed the hard part was behind them. Marcus had even brought coffee and pastries, as if this were a celebration rather than a confrontation. Bessie, Catherine said with a bright smile, we're so glad you've had time to think about our discussion yesterday. We know this transition isn't easy, but we're committed to making it as smooth as possible. I took my seat at the head of the table, the same chair our father had occupied during family meetings for decades. Mrs. Rodriguez sat to my right, pen poised over her notepad, ready to record every word of what was about to unfold. Actually, I said, opening the folder Richard had prepared for me, I have some questions about this transition you've planned. Patricia leaned forward eagerly. Of course. We want to address any concerns you might have. My first concern, I said, pulling out the loan documents, is about the $15.7 million you collectively owe me. I assume you'll be settling these debts before taking control of company operations? The room went very quiet. David shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Bessie, those weren't formal loans. That was family helping family. I slid copies of the promissory notes across the table to each of them. According to these legal documents, they were very formal loans. Signed, witnessed, and legally binding. My attorney assures me they are completely enforceable. Marcus picked up his copy and scanned it quickly, his face growing pale as he read. This is ridiculous. You never mentioned interest rates or repayment terms when you gave us this money. I didn't need to mention them, I replied calmly. The terms were established by our father's estate attorneys and documented properly at the time of each transaction. You'll notice that the loans become immediately due and payable if you act against my interests or attempt to remove me from company leadership. James was staring at his copy like it might disappear if he looked hard enough. You can't retroactively change the terms of gifts into loans just because you're angry. I turned to Mrs. Rodriguez. Please note that Mr. James Franklin has just accused me of fraud and document falsification. I'm sure our legal department will want to follow up on that allegation. James's face flushed red. I didn't say that. I just said. You said I was trying to retroactively change gifts into loans, I interrupted. But these documents were prepared at the time of each transaction, not yesterday. They've been on file with our attorneys for years. The only thing that changed yesterday was your decision to trigger the default clauses. Catherine was reading through her copy more carefully now, and I could see the exact moment when she realized the scope of what she was looking at. This says I owe you $2.1 million, plus accumulated interest at 8% annually. That's impossible. Let me help you with the math, I said, pulling out the detailed accounting Mrs. Rodriguez had prepared. Your divorce settlement in 2018, $400,000. Your son's legal troubles in 2019, $350,000. The investment in your boutique that failed in 2020, $600,000. Your daughter's college expenses that weren't covered by her scholarship, $200,000. Various personal loans and credit card bailouts, $550,000. The interest has been accumulating since each transaction. Patricia was adding up her own numbers, her face growing ashen as the total became clear. Even if these are legitimate loans, we don't have this kind of money. You know we don't have liquid assets like this. That's unfortunate, I said. But debt doesn't disappear just because it's inconvenient. However, I'm prepared to offer you several options for settlement. Marcus leaned back in his chair, his expression hardening. What kind of options? I pulled out the next set of documents Richard had prepared. Option 1, immediate cash payment in full, which would clear your debts and allow you to retain your current positions in the company. Option 2, you can sell your Franklin Industries shares back to me at current market value, which should cover most of what you owe. Option 3, you can sign over your shares to the family trust, which will provide you with annual dividend payments but no voting rights or management authority. And if we choose none of those options? David asked quietly. Then I'll be forced to pursue legal collection of the debts, which will likely result in liens against your personal assets, garnishment of your salaries, and potential bankruptcy proceedings. It would also trigger the termination clauses in your employment contracts, since you'd be in default on financial obligations to the company's majority shareholder. The silence stretched out for so long that I could hear the air conditioning cycling on and off. They were all staring at the documents spread in front of them, trying to process the fact that their attempt to push me aside had instead put them in the most vulnerable position of their lives. Finally, Catherine spoke, her voice smaller than I'd ever heard it. How long have you known about these loan documents? I've known they existed since the day our father died, I replied. What I learned yesterday was that you'd chosen to activate them. This is insane, Marcus said, his voice rising with desperation. You're trying to destroy your own family over hurt feelings. I looked at him across the table, this man I'd bailed out of failed business ventures 3 separate times, who'd never thanked me for saving his house or his marriage or his reputation. Yesterday you told me I was the most useless member of this family. You said I contributed nothing to the company our father built. You made plans to remove me from the business I've run successfully for 15 years. Did you think there would be no consequences for that? We were trying to help the company grow, Patricia protested. We weren't trying to hurt you personally. You called a meeting specifically to tell me I was worthless, I said. You'd already met with attorneys about removing me from leadership without consulting me. You'd made decisions about my future without including me in the discussion. How exactly was that not personal? James ran his hands through his hair, looking older than his 55 years. What do you want from us, Bessie? An apology? Fine, I'm sorry. We're all sorry. Can we move past this? I studied his face, searching for any sign of genuine remorse, any indication that he understood the magnitude of what they'd done. But all I saw was a man who was sorry he'd been caught, sorry his plan had backfired, sorry he was facing consequences he hadn't anticipated. What I want, I said slowly, is for you to understand that actions have consequences. What I want is for you to recognize that the woman you called useless has been carrying this family for 15 years. What I want is for you to acknowledge that everything you've accomplished, every opportunity you've had, every crisis you've survived, has been possible because of my support. We acknowledge that, Catherine said quickly. We're grateful for everything you've done. Are you? I asked. Because yesterday you seemed to think I'd done nothing at all. David cleared his throat nervously. Look, maybe we were too harsh yesterday. Maybe we didn't express ourselves well. But this seems like an extreme response. I pulled out the final document from my folder, the one that had surprised even me when Richard explained it. This is a forensic accounting report on Franklin Industries' performance over the past 15 years. It details every major decision, every strategic initiative, every financial milestone achieved during my tenure as CEO. I opened to the executive summary and began reading selected highlights. Revenue growth of 430%, expansion into 6 new international markets, acquisition of 12 competitor companies, development of 3 new product lines that now account for 60% of our profits, employment growth from 800 to over 3,000 workers, increase in company valuation from $400 million to $2.1 billion. I closed the report and looked around the table. That's what your useless sister accomplished while you were focusing on your individual departments. That's what the most worthless member of this family contributed to our success. The numbers hung in the air like an indictment. For 15 years, they'd benefited from the growth and stability I'd created while apparently believing they were carrying me rather than the other way around. They'd enjoyed the prestige of working for one of the most successful companies in the region while dismissing the leadership that made that success possible. We didn't know, Patricia whispered. You didn't ask, I corrected. You didn't pay attention to board reports or strategic planning sessions or financial analyses. You focused on your own areas and assumed someone else was handling the big picture. Well, I was handling the big picture. I've been handling it for 15 years. Marcus was studying the forensic report, flipping through pages of data that documented just how wrong they'd been about my contributions. Even if all of this is true, he said finally, it doesn't change the fact that we think the company needs new leadership to stay competitive. I felt something cold settle in my chest. Even confronted with overwhelming evidence of their error, even facing financial ruin because of their betrayal, they still couldn't admit they'd been wrong about me. They still believed, despite everything, that I was somehow inadequate for the job I'd been doing successfully for 15 years. I see, I said quietly. So your position is that despite growing the company by 400%, despite increasing employment by nearly 4 times, despite building Franklin Industries into one of the most respected businesses in the state, I'm still not qualified to continue as CEO? We think fresh perspectives would be beneficial, Catherine said carefully. Fresh perspectives, I repeated. From people who didn't know the company had grown by 400%. From people who owe me collectively over $15 million. From people who thought they could push me aside without consequences. I stood up from the table, gathering my documents into neat stacks. Mrs. Rodriguez, please note that the Franklin family board members have declined to settle their outstanding loan obligations and have confirmed their intention to pursue removal of current company leadership, despite being presented with clear evidence of exceptional performance metrics. Mrs. Rodriguez wrote diligently in her notepad while my siblings watched with growing alarm. They were beginning to realize that this wasn't a negotiation, it was a formal proceeding with legal implications they hadn't anticipated. What happens now? David asked. I looked at each of them one final time, These people I protected and supported and loved for my entire adult life. Now you'll hear from our attorneys about the loan collections process. You'll receive formal termination notices ending your employment with Franklin Industries. And you'll discover what this company looks like when it's run by someone you consider useless. You can't fire us, Marcus said, standing up abruptly. We're family. We're board members. Your employees whose contracts include morality clauses and financial responsibility requirements, I replied. You've violated both. As for being board members, that privilege came with your stock ownership, which you'll be forfeiting to satisfy your debt obligations. I walked toward the door, then paused and turned back one more time. Oh, and one more thing. Effective immediately, all financial support, loans, and bailouts are discontinued. Whatever happens to you from this point forward, you'll be handling on your own. I left them sitting around that boardroom table, finally understanding the scope of what they'd lost through their betrayal. But I wasn't finished yet. There were still preparations to make, calls to place, and people to inform. By the end of the day, everyone who mattered would know that Bessie Franklin wasn't stepping down quietly. She was taking back everything that had always been hers. Within 24 hours of that boardroom confrontation, the entire landscape of my family's world had shifted in ways they never could have imagined. I spent the rest of that Tuesday afternoon in my office, making phone calls that would reshape Franklin Industries and ensure my siblings understood exactly what they'd thrown away when they decided I was expendable. My first call was to Elizabeth Chen, the head of our Human Resources Department. Elizabeth had been with the company for 8 years and had worked closely with me on every major personnel decision during that time. She was thorough, professional, and completely loyal to the company's interests rather than any individual personalities. Elizabeth, I said when she answered, I need you to prepare termination packages for Marcus, Catherine, James, Patricia, and David Franklin. Effective immediately. There was a brief pause. Mrs. Franklin, are you certain? This will require board approval for executive-level terminations. I am the board, I replied calmly. As majority shareholder, I have the authority to make this decision unilaterally. Please review their employment contracts for any obligations regarding severance or benefits, but I want them officially separated from the company by close of business today. Elizabeth's voice remained steady, though I could hear the surprise beneath her professional demeanor. Of course. Should I schedule individual meetings to discuss their departures? No meetings, I said firmly. Send the termination letters by certified mail and have security escort them from the premises if they attempt to enter company property. Their access cards and company vehicles should be deactivated within the hour. After hanging up with Elizabeth, I called our Chief Financial Officer, Robert Hayes. Robert had been instrumental in implementing many of the strategic initiatives that had driven our growth over the past decade, and he understood the financial implications of family dynamics better than anyone else in the company. Robert, I said, I need you to initiate collection proceedings on approximately $15.7 million in outstanding loans to former family members. Richard Morrison's office will provide you with all the documentation. Robert had worked with family-owned businesses long enough to understand what this meant without requiring extensive explanation. Understood, Mrs. Franklin. Should I coordinate with our legal department on the collection strategy? Yes, but I want you to be aggressive. These aren't friendly family loans anymore. They're business obligations that are seriously past due. Use every legal mechanism available to ensure prompt payment. My third call was to Janet Williams, our Director of Public Relations. Janet had managed Franklin Industries' reputation through several challenging periods, including economic downturns and competitive threats, but she'd never had to handle a public family dispute. Still, she was exactly the kind of strategic thinker I needed for what was coming next. Janet, I said, I need you to prepare a press release announcing leadership changes at Franklin Industries. The key message is stability and continuity under proven leadership. What kind of leadership changes? She asked carefully. My 5 siblings are no longer with the company in any capacity. I want the business community to understand that this strengthens rather than weakens our position. Janet was quiet for a moment, processing the implications. Mrs. Franklin, this is going to generate significant media attention. Family business disputes always do. How do you want me to handle questions about the reasons for their departure? With complete honesty, I replied. We have documentation showing that Franklin Industries has achieved unprecedented growth and profitability under current leadership. We have records demonstrating that the departing family members were not contributing to strategic decision-making in ways that supported continued success. Present this as a business decision made in the best interests of our employees, shareholders, and clients. What about personal statements from your siblings? They may want to tell their side of the story. I considered this carefully. My siblings would undoubtedly try to spin their termination as evidence of my instability or vindictiveness. They'd probably claim they were the victims of a power-hungry sister who couldn't handle criticism. But I had advantages they didn't: documentation, financial records, and a 15-year track record of success. Let them talk, I said finally. But make sure the media has access to our financial performance data and strategic achievements. Let the numbers speak for themselves. By 4 o'clock that afternoon, the termination letters had been delivered, and my siblings' access to Franklin Industries had been completely severed. Elizabeth called to confirm that security had escorted James from the building when he'd attempted to enter through the executive parking garage, apparently unaware that his key card had already been deactivated. He was quite upset, Elizabeth reported diplomatically. He demanded to speak with you directly and became rather vocal when I explained that was not possible. Did he say anything specific? I asked. He accused you of having a mental breakdown and said the family would be taking legal action to have you declared incompetent. He also mentioned something about contacting the board of directors, though I explained that you are the board of directors. I wasn't surprised by James's reaction. He'd always been the most volatile of my siblings, the one most likely to lash out when he didn't get his way. But his threat about having me declared incompetent was interesting. It suggested they still didn't understand the legal reality of their situation. Please document everything he said, I told Elizabeth. Our attorneys may need those statements later. Around 5 o'clock, my phone started ringing with calls from my siblings. I let every call go to voicemail, but I listened to each message to gauge their emotional state and understanding of what was happening to them. Marcus's message was the most controlled, though I could hear the barely contained anger in his voice. Bessie, this is insane. You can't destroy the entire family over one disagreement. Call me back so we can work this out like adults. Catherine's message was tearful and desperate. I don't understand what's happening. The bank called about loan payments I didn't know I owed. Please call me back. We need to talk about this. Patricia left 3 separate messages, each one more frantic than the last. In the final one, she was openly crying. You're ruining my children's future. How can you do this to your own family? What would Dad think of what you're doing? David's message was brief and bitter. You've lost your mind, Bessie. This vendetta is going to destroy everything Dad built. I hope you're satisfied. James didn't leave a message, but Mrs. Rodriguez informed me that he'd called the office 6 times demanding to speak with me directly. When she'd explained that I wasn't taking calls, he'd hung up on her each time. That evening, I drove home to the family estate for what I knew would be a confrontation. My siblings' cars were already in the driveway when I arrived, and I could see lights on throughout the main floor. They'd apparently decided to have a family meeting without me, probably trying to figure out how to reverse what had happened to them. I sat in my car for several minutes, gathering my thoughts and preparing for what was likely to be the most difficult conversation of my life. These were people I'd loved unconditionally for decades, people I'd protected and supported through every crisis they'd faced. But they'd proven themselves capable of betraying that love when it served their interests. And I could never forget that lesson. When I walked through the front door, I could hear their voices in the main parlor, agitated and overlapping as they talked over each other. The conversation stopped abruptly when they heard my footsteps in the hallway. I entered the parlor to find all 5 of them waiting for me, their faces a mixture of anger, confusion, and desperation. They'd helped themselves to my liquor again, but this time the alcohol seemed to have made them more volatile, rather than more relaxed. Finally, Marcus said, standing up as I entered, "We need to talk." "I don't think we do," I replied calmly. "I think I've made my position quite clear." Catherine stood up as well, her eyes red from crying. "Bessie, please, you're destroying everything. Our jobs, our homes, our children's security. This isn't who you are." "Isn't it?" I asked. "How do you know who I am? Yesterday you told me I was useless. You said I contributed nothing to this family or this company. So why would my actions today surprise you? Patricia moved toward me, her hands outstretched in a pleading gesture. We made a mistake. We were wrong about your contributions to the company. We're sorry. Can't we put this behind us and move forward? I looked at her carefully, searching for any sign of genuine understanding or remorse. What exactly were you wrong about, Patricia? She blinked, clearly not expecting the question. We underestimated your role in the company's success. And we shouldn't have suggested you step down without discussing it with you first. Is that all? She looked confused. What else do you want us to say? I realized in that moment that they still didn't truly understand what they'd done. They thought this was about hurt feelings or wounded pride. They thought an apology and an acknowledgement of my business contributions would be enough to repair the damage they'd caused. You want to know what else? I said quietly. You spent months planning to betray me. You made decisions about my future without including me. You called me worthless while living off my financial support. You dismissed 15 years of my leadership while accepting the benefits of the success I'd created. And even now, faced with the consequences of your actions, you still think this is something we can just put behind us. James stepped forward, his face flushed with anger and alcohol. You're right, we made mistakes. But what you're doing now is 10 times worse. You're trying to destroy your own family over your hurt feelings. My hurt feelings? I repeated. James, you owe me $4.2 million. You've been terminated from a job where you are earning $300,000 a year. Your house, your cars, your children's education fund, all of it is at risk because of debts you legally owe me. This isn't about hurt feelings. This is about the consequences of betraying someone who'd spent 15 years protecting you. David had been quiet during this exchange, but now he spoke up. What do you want from us, Bessie? What will it take to end this? It was a fair question, and I'd been thinking about the answer since I'd left Richard's office that morning. What did I want? An apology? They'd offered that, though it felt hollow and incomplete. An acknowledgement of my contributions? They'd provided that too, reluctantly, and only under pressure. A promise that they'd never again try to undermine my authority? That would be meaningless, coming from people who'd already proven they couldn't be trusted. What I want, I said slowly, is for you to understand that your actions have consequences. What I want is for you to experience what it feels like to lose everything you've taken for granted. What I want is for you to learn that the sister you called useless has been the foundation of your comfortable lives for 15 years. So this is about revenge, Marcus said bitterly. This is about justice. I corrected. This is about ensuring that people who betray their family understand the full cost of that betrayal. Catherine was crying again, but quietly this time. What about our children, Bessie? They didn't do anything wrong. Are you going to punish them for our mistakes? The question hit me harder than I'd expected. My siblings' children were innocent in all of this. They'd grown up secure in the knowledge that their family was wealthy and stable, that their education and future opportunities were guaranteed. They didn't deserve to suffer because their parents had made catastrophically poor decisions. But they also didn't deserve to benefit from those poor decisions without understanding their cost. They needed to learn that security and stability came from hard work and integrity, not from taking advantage of family members who couldn't fight back. Your children will be fine, I said finally. But they'll learn to be fine through their own efforts, not through my continued subsidization of your poor choices. Patricia shook her head desperately. You can't mean that. Some of them are still in college. Some of them have never had to work for anything. They won't know how to survive without family support. Then they'll learn, I replied, the same way millions of other young people learn, through necessity and determination, and the understanding that no one owes them a comfortable life. The room fell silent again. I could see them processing the reality that this wasn't a temporary punishment or a negotiating tactic. This was a permanent change in the fundamental structure of their lives. The safety net they'd taken for granted was gone, and it wasn't coming back. There has to be something we can do to fix this, Catherine said quietly. Some way to make amends. I considered her words carefully. There were ways they could potentially earn back some measure of trust and support, but it would require genuine change in their attitudes and behavior. It would require them to acknowledge not just that they'd made a mistake, but that they'd revealed something fundamental about their character that needed to be addressed. There might be, I said finally, but it would require more than apologies and promises. It would require you to demonstrate through your actions that you understand what you did wrong and why it was wrong. Marcus leaned forward eagerly. What kind of actions? First, you'd need to publicly acknowledge that your attempt to remove me from company leadership was based on false assumptions about my capabilities and contributions. Not just to me, but to our employees, our clients, and the business community. David's face darkened. You want us to humiliate ourselves publicly? I want you to tell the truth publicly, I corrected. The same truth you were perfectly willing to distort when it served your purposes. What else? Patricia asked. Second, you'd need to find employment outside of Franklin Industries and demonstrate that you can be successful without my support or protection. You'd need to prove that you have value as professionals independent of your family connections. James laughed bitterly. You want us to start over from scratch at our ages, with our reputations damaged by being fired from the family business? I want you to discover what your skills and abilities are actually worth in the real world, I replied. Something you've never had to learn because I've been providing you with comfortable positions regardless of your performance. Catherine was shaking her head. Even if we did all of that, it wouldn't change the fact that we owe you millions of dollars we don't have. No, it wouldn't, I agreed. But it might demonstrate that you're serious about rebuilding the trust you destroyed. And people who are serious about rebuilding trust find ways to honor their obligations, even when it's difficult. I walked toward the door, then turned back to face them one more time. You have a choice to make. You can spend your energy trying to fight me legally or publicly, trying to convince people that I'm unstable or vindictive. Or you can spend that energy proving that you're better people than your actions this week have suggested. And if we choose to fight you, Marcus asked, then you'll discover that I have resources and legal protections you never knew existed. You'll learn that the woman you called useless has been preparing for this possibility for 15 years, and you'll find out what it really means to lose everything. I left them there in the parlor, probably already planning their next move, trying to figure out how to minimize the damage to their lives. But I wasn't finished with my preparations. There were still calls to make, people to inform, and strategies to implement. The next morning, I arrived at Franklin Industries to find reporters waiting in the parking lot. Janet had released the press statement about leadership changes the evening before, and the business media had picked up the story immediately. Family business disputes were always newsworthy, especially when they involved companies as prominent as Franklin Industries. I walked past the reporters without comment, though I noticed they were already asking informed questions about company performance and family dynamics. Janet had done her job well, providing them with enough factual information to understand the broader context of what was happening. Mrs. Rodriguez greeted me with a stack of phone messages and a carefully neutral expression. Good morning, Mrs. Franklin. You've received calls from 3 television stations, 2 newspapers, and the Charlotte Business Journal. They're all requesting interviews. Schedule them, I said. All of them. I want to tell this story before anyone else tries to tell it for me. She looked surprised. Are you certain? Family disputes can be difficult to manage in the media. Mrs. Rodriguez, I said, settling into my chair and opening the first file of the day. For 15 years, I've been managing this family quietly, privately, trying to protect everyone's reputation and dignity. Look where that got me. It's time for a different approach. My first interview was scheduled for that afternoon with Rebecca Martinez from the Charlotte Business Journal. Rebecca was a veteran business reporter who'd covered Franklin Industries several times over the years, always with accuracy and fairness. If anyone could present the facts of this situation objectively, it would be her. She arrived at my office precisely on time, carrying a digital recorder and a notepad filled with preliminary questions. I prepared for this conversation carefully, gathering documents and financial records that would support every claim I intended to make. Mrs. Franklin, she began after we'd settled in the conference area of my office. Yesterday's announcement about leadership changes at Franklin Industries has generated significant interest in the business community. Can you walk me through what led to these decisions? I'd rehearsed this answer, but I wanted it to sound natural and sincere. Rebecca, for 15 years, I've had the privilege of leading Franklin Industries through a period of unprecedented growth and success. During that time, I've also had the responsibility of managing family relationships and trying to ensure that personal dynamics didn't interfere with business operations. But those efforts weren't successful? Unfortunately, some family members began to believe that their individual contributions were more significant than they actually were, while simultaneously believing that my contributions were less significant than the record shows. When that disconnect became irreconcilable, I had to make decisions based on what was best for the company and its stakeholders. Rebecca consulted her notes. Your siblings have suggested that this dispute is really about personal conflicts rather than business performance. How do you respond to that? I pulled out the forensic accounting report Richard had prepared. The numbers speak for themselves. Under my leadership, Franklin Industries has grown from a $400 million company to a business valued at over $2 billion. We've expanded into international markets, acquired strategic competitors, and increased employment by nearly 400%. These aren't personal opinions, they're measurable achievements. But your siblings were also involved in managing various aspects of the business during this period. Don't they deserve some credit for these successes? Absolutely, I said. Each of them managed their individual departments competently. But departmental management and strategic leadership are very different responsibilities. The decisions that drove our major growth initiatives, the vision that positioned us for expansion, the financial management that allowed us to weather economic challenges, those came from the executive level. Rebecca leaned forward slightly. There are rumors about significant financial disputes between you and your siblings. Can you comment on that? This was the question I had been expecting, and I was ready for it. Over the past 15 years, I've provided substantial financial support to family members during various personal crises. Those transactions were properly documented as loans with specific terms for repayment. Recently, I discovered that some family members had forgotten about their obligations and were making business decisions without considering their personal financial responsibilities to the company. How substantial are we talking about? The total amount of outstanding loans is approximately $15.7 million. Rebecca's eyebrows rose slightly, but she maintained her professional composure. That's a significant sum. Are you actively pursuing collection of these debts? I'm pursuing collection through normal legal channels, yes. Franklin Industries has a responsibility to its shareholders and stakeholders to manage all assets appropriately, including outstanding loans. Your siblings might argue that family financial support shouldn't be treated as formal business obligations. I opened the folder containing copies of the promissory notes and loan agreements. These documents were prepared by our legal department at the time of each transaction. The terms were clearly established, and the obligations were properly witnessed and recorded. The fact that the borrowers may have treated them casually doesn't change their legal validity. The interview continued for another 30 minutes, covering topics ranging from succession planning to the future strategic direction of Franklin Industries. Throughout the conversation, I was careful to present facts rather than emotions, to focus on business implications rather than personal grievances. When Rebecca left, I felt cautiously optimistic about how the story would be presented. She'd asked tough questions, but had also listened carefully to my answers and reviewed the documentation I'd provided. The article that resulted would either establish my credibility in this dispute or undermine it completely. That evening, I returned home to find my siblings waiting for me again. But this time, the atmosphere was different. They looked exhausted, defeated, like people who were beginning to understand the scope of what they were facing. Catherine spoke first, her voice subdued. We saw the reporters at the company today. We know you're telling your side of the story publicly. I'm telling the truth publicly, I corrected. Something that apparently needed to be done. Marcus sat heavily in one of the antique chairs. The business community is already choosing sides. 3 of our biggest clients called today to express concern about stability at Franklin Industries. What did you tell them? That there was no instability, that you were still in charge and the company was still strong. He looked up at me with something that might have been respect. Because that's the truth, isn't it? We were never really running anything. We were just managing the pieces you allowed us to manage. It was the first sign of genuine understanding I'd seen from any of them. Yes, I said quietly. That's the truth. Patricia wiped her eyes with a tissue. We talked to lawyers today about the loan documents. They said everything is legitimate and enforceable. They said we don't have any legal options for challenging them. They're right. James was staring at the floor. $15.7 million. Even if we sold everything we own, we couldn't come close to paying that back. No, you couldn't. David looked at me with exhausted eyes. So what happens now, Bessie? Do we lose everything? Do our children lose everything? I studied their faces. These people who'd been so confident 2 days ago, so certain they could push me aside and take control of what they wanted. Now they were discovering what it felt like to be truly powerless, truly dependent on someone else's decisions about their future. What happens now, I said slowly, depends on what you do next. You can keep fighting me, keep trying to find ways to avoid responsibility for your actions, or you can start demonstrating that you understand what you did wrong and why it was wrong. How do we do that? Catherine asked. You start by acknowledging publicly that your attempt to remove me from company leadership was based on false information and poor judgment. You admit that you underestimated my contributions and overestimated your own. You take full responsibility for the situation you're in now. Marcus shook his head. That would destroy what's left of our reputations. Your reputations were destroyed the moment you decided to betray the person who'd been supporting you for 15 years. I replied. The only question now is whether you rebuild them through honesty and hard work, or whether you let them stay destroyed through pride and stubbornness. The room was quiet for a long moment. Then Patricia spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. If we do what you're asking, if we publicly admit we were wrong, would you consider reducing the loan amounts we owe? I considered the question carefully. I might consider payment plans that would allow you to satisfy your obligations over time without declaring bankruptcy. But the debts themselves aren't going to disappear. You accepted that money when you needed it, and you need to honor your commitments to repay it. Even if it takes the rest of our lives? James asked. Even if it takes the rest of your lives, I confirmed. That's what obligation means. That's what responsibility looks like. They exchanged glances, and I could see them trying to process this new reality. For 15 years, they'd lived in a world where their mistakes were quietly fixed, where their poor decisions had no lasting consequences, where their big sister would always be there to make everything right. That world was gone, and they were finally beginning to understand what life looked like without it. We need time to think about this, David said finally. Take all the time you need, I replied, but understand that the situation isn't going to improve while you're thinking. The debts are accruing interest daily. Your employment terminations are becoming more permanent every day you're not working. And your reputations are being defined by your silence, while I'm the only one talking to the media. I left them there to consider their options, but I was no longer waiting for their decision to move forward with my plans. The next phase of my strategy was already in motion, and it would proceed whether they chose to cooperate or not. The transformation in my siblings' demeanor became apparent within the first week after our final confrontation. Where once they had moved through their lives with the confident ease of people who knew their place in the world was secure, now they carried themselves with the careful hesitation of individuals who had discovered that everything they'd taken for granted could disappear overnight. Marcus was the first to break. On Thursday morning, exactly 1 week after they'd called me useless, he appeared at my office without an appointment. Mrs. Rodriguez buzzed me to say he was in the reception area, asking to speak with me privately. I could have refused to see him. Could have had security escort him from the building as they'd done 3 days earlier when he'd tried to access his former office. Instead, I told her to send him in. He entered my office looking like he'd aged a decade in 7 days. His usually impeccable appearance was disheveled, his expensive suit wrinkled, his face drawn with the kind of exhaustion that comes from sleepless nights spent calculating impossible mathematics. He stood in front of my desk without being invited to sit, his hands clasped behind his back like a schoolchild called before the principal. "Bessie," he said, his voice lacking any of the confidence I'd grown accustomed to hearing from him. I need to ask you something, and I need you to give me an honest answer. I gestured toward the chair across from my desk. Sit down, Marcus. Ask your question. He remained standing. Did you plan this? Did you spend years setting us up for this moment, documenting our loans, and preparing legal mechanisms to destroy us the minute we stepped out of line? It was a fair question, and one I'd been asking myself as well. Had some part of me always known this day would come? Had I unconsciously prepared for the possibility that the people I loved most would eventually betray me? No, I said honestly. I never planned this. Every financial assistance I provided was given because I genuinely wanted to help. Every legal document was prepared by our father's attorneys as standard practice, not because I anticipated needing them. What happened last week was your choice, not mine. He finally sat down, his shoulders sagging with what looked like relief. I needed to know. Because if you'd planned this, if you'd been manipulating us all along, then maybe I could have found a way to hate you for it. But you didn't plan it, did you? You just responded to what we forced you to respond to. That's correct. Marcus rubbed his face with both hands. The reporters have been calling constantly. They want to know our side of the story, want us to explain why we thought you should step down. But every time I try to formulate an answer, I realize how weak our reasoning was. Tell me what you thought our reasoning was. He looked up at me with eyes that held none of the arrogance I'd seen the week before. We thought you were stuck in the past, too conservative, too risk-averse. We thought the company needed younger leadership, with fresh ideas and stronger connections to modern markets. And now? Now I've spent a week trying to find employment in those modern markets, he said bitterly. Do you know what I discovered? That my reputation is entirely built on being a Franklin, on working for a successful family business. Without that connection, I'm just another middle-aged executive, with no unique skills and no independent track record. I nodded but said nothing, letting him continue. Catherine's been calling potential employers too. So have James and Patricia and David. We've all been making the same discovery. We're not the valuable professionals we thought we were. We're people who've been carried by the success of a company we didn't build and protected by the reputation of a family name we didn't earn. What about your individual achievements within the company? Your departmental successes? Marcus laughed, but there was no humor in it. What successes? I ran the international division, but every major expansion decision was made by you. I managed client relationships, but those relationships existed because of the company's overall reputation, not because of my personal abilities. I supervised operational improvements, but the strategic vision that made those improvements profitable came from the executive level. He stood up and walked to the window that overlooked the factory floor. I keep thinking about that forensic accounting report you showed us. 400% revenue growth over 15 years. Do you know what my contribution to that growth actually was? I implemented decisions you made. I managed processes you designed. I maintained relationships you established. You did those things competently, I said. Implementation and management are important skills. But they're not leadership skills, he replied. They're not the skills that build companies or create value or drive innovation. They're just the skills that keep existing systems running smoothly. I joined him at the window, looking down at the employees who were preparing for the shift change. What are you trying to tell me, Marcus? I'm trying to tell you that we were wrong, not just wrong about your capabilities, but wrong about our own. We convinced ourselves that we were carrying you, that you were some kind of figurehead who got credit for work we were actually doing. But it was the opposite, wasn't it? You were carrying us. The admission hung in the air between us. For 15 years, I'd managed my siblings' egos carefully, making sure they felt valued and important, ensuring they understood their roles as significant contributors to the family's success. I'd been so focused on maintaining harmony that I'd never forced them to confront the reality of their actual contributions. Yes, I said quietly, I was carrying you. All of you. Marcus turned away from the window to face me directly. The others are still trying to figure out how to fight this. how to find some legal or financial way to avoid the consequences of what we did. But I can't do that anymore. I can't pretend this is about anything other than the fact that we betrayed someone who'd spent 15 years protecting us. What are you saying? I'm saying I want to accept responsibility for my actions. I want to publicly acknowledge that our attempt to remove you from company leadership was based on false assumptions and poor judgment. I want to admit that we underestimated your contributions and overestimated our own. I studied his face carefully, searching for any sign of manipulation or calculation, but all I saw was exhaustion and what appeared to be genuine remorse. And the financial obligations, the $4.2 million you owe? Marcus's jaw tightened, but he maintained eye contact. I'll honor those obligations. I don't know how yet, but I'll find a way. Even if it takes the rest of my life, I'll pay back what I owe. It will take the rest of your life, I said bluntly. Even with a generous payment plan, you'll be making payments on this debt until you're too old to work. I understand that. Your standard of living will change dramatically. No more expensive cars, no more luxury vacations, no more country club memberships. You'll be living like someone who earns a middle-class salary, instead of someone who inherits wealth. I understand that too. I walked back to my desk and pulled out a legal document Richard had prepared for exactly this scenario. This is a formal acknowledgement of debt and repayment agreement. It establishes a 30-year payment schedule at 6% interest, with penalties for missed payments and provisions for wage garnishment if necessary. Marcus took the document and read through it carefully. The terms were harsh but not impossible. If he found steady employment and lived modestly, he could make the payments without declaring bankruptcy. But there would be no margin for error, no room for the kind of financial carelessness that had characterized his adult life. If I sign this, he said, what happens to my relationship with the family? With you? That depends on your actions going forward, I replied. If you honor your commitments, if you demonstrate genuine understanding of what you did wrong, if you rebuild your life through your own efforts rather than expecting continued support, then maybe we can eventually rebuild some measure of trust. And if I don't, then you'll discover what it means to be truly alone in the world. Marcus signed the document without further hesitation. As he handed it back to me, he said, I have one more question. Why are you giving me this opportunity? After what we did, why aren't you just destroying us completely? I considered his question carefully. The truth was, I could have destroyed them completely. I had the legal authority and financial power to ensure they lost everything, to make certain they never recovered from their betrayal. But complete destruction wouldn't accomplish anything beyond satisfying my anger, and I'd learned over the past week that anger was a poor foundation for important decisions. Because, I said finally, you're still my brother. You're still part of this family, even though you forgot what that meant. And because I believe people can change when they're forced to confront the consequences of their actions. Marcus nodded, his eyes bright with what might have been tears. I won't disappoint you again, Bessie, I promise. Don't make promises to me, I replied. Make commitments to yourself. Prove that you're capable of being the man our father hoped you'd become. After Marcus left, I called Richard to inform him that one family member had accepted responsibility and signed a repayment agreement. He was pleased but not surprised. I expected Marcus would be the first to break, he said. He's always been the most pragmatic of your siblings. What about the others? They're still in denial, still looking for ways to avoid accountability. They won't find any, Richard said confidently. The legal framework is solid, and they have no viable options for challenging it. Eventually, they'll all have to make the same choice Marcus made. But Richard was wrong about the timeline. It took another 3 weeks for Catherine to reach the same conclusion as Marcus, and her capitulation came only after she'd exhausted every possible avenue for avoiding responsibility. During those 3 weeks, she'd hired her own attorney and attempted to challenge the validity of the loan documents. When that failed, she'd tried to argue that the interest rates were usurious and legally unenforceable. When that failed as well, she'd approached several media outlets with a story about a vindictive sister who was using technicalities to destroy her own family. The media strategy backfired spectacularly. The business reporters who interviewed Catherine were the same ones who'd already spoken with me, who'd reviewed the financial records and forensic accounting reports. When Catherine tried to portray herself as a victim of my unreasonable demands, they asked pointed questions about her actual contributions to the company's success and her understanding of the loan agreements she'd signed. The resulting articles were devastating to her credibility. One particularly thorough piece in the Charlotte Business Journal included a sidebar comparing the growth of Catherine's retail division with the overall company growth during the same period. The numbers showed clearly that her division had consistently underperformed relative to company-wide metrics, and that several of her major initiatives had required intervention from executive leadership to avoid significant losses. Catherine appeared at my office on a Friday afternoon, looking defeated and desperate. Unlike Marcus, she didn't ask permission to sit down. She collapsed into the chair across from my desk and immediately began crying. "I can't do this anymore," she said through her tears. "I can't fight you. I can't pay the lawyers. I can't handle the reporters calling me incompetent in print. You've won, Bessie. You've destroyed me completely." "I haven't destroyed you," I replied calmly. "I've stopped protecting you from the consequences of your own actions. There's a difference." "What's the difference? My reputation is ruined. My finances are in shambles. My children are ashamed of me. How is that not destruction?" I pulled out the same type of repayment agreement I'd offered Marcus. "The difference is that you still have choices. You can accept responsibility, honor your obligations, and rebuild your life through your own efforts. Or you can continue fighting reality until you actually are destroyed." Catherine looked at the document like it was a death sentence. $2.1 million. Even with 30 years to pay it back, that's over $6,000 a month. I can't earn that kind of money. I don't have skills that are worth that kind of money. Then you'll need to develop skills that are worth that kind of money. I'm 52 years old, Bessie. Who's going to hire a 52-year-old woman with no independent work experience and a reputation for being fired from her family's business? The same people who hire other 52-year-old women with comparable qualifications, I replied. You'll start at entry level, you'll work your way up, and you'll prove your value through performance rather than family connections. Catherine wiped her eyes with a tissue from the box on my desk. Do you hate me? Do you hate all of us? It was the same question Marcus had asked in a different form, and it deserved an honest answer. No, I don't hate you. I'm disappointed in you. I'm hurt by what you did. But I don't hate you. Then why are you being so harsh with us? Because harsh consequences are the only thing that will force you to change. For 15 years, I protected you from the results of your poor decisions. I enabled your irresponsibility by making sure you never had to face real hardship. That approach didn't help you grow as people. It kept you dependent and entitled. Catherine signed the repayment agreement with shaking hands. As she prepared to leave, she turned back to me with a question I hadn't expected. What would Dad think of what you're doing? I'd been wondering the same thing myself. Samuel Franklin had been a man who valued both family loyalty and personal accountability. He'd loved his children deeply, but he'd also understood their weaknesses better than they understood them themselves. I think he'd be proud that I finally learned to stop enabling destructive behavior, I said. And I think he'd be disappointed that it took his children this long to learn accountability. Patricia and David held out for another month, hiring attorneys and exploring every possible legal challenge to their situation. But Richard had been thorough in his preparation, and the estate planning documents were ironclad. Eventually, they too accepted repayment agreements and began the long process of rebuilding their lives without the safety net of family wealth. James was the last holdout, and his resistance took a different form entirely. Instead of hiring lawyers or challenging the loan documents, he simply disappeared. One day he was living in the house I'd purchased for him years earlier, and the next day the house was empty and he was gone. Mrs. Rodriguez informed me that he'd called the office to say he was leaving North Carolina permanently and would not be providing a forwarding address. He'd abandoned his possessions, his local relationships, and his financial obligations, apparently believing he could start over somewhere else without consequence. I hired a private investigator to locate him, not because I was vindictive, but because $15 million in outstanding debts don't disappear simply because the debtor relocates. Within 6 weeks, the investigator had tracked James to Las Vegas, where he'd found work as a casino floor supervisor and was living in a cheap apartment under his own name. The Nevada courts were cooperative in enforcing the North Carolina judgment, and James discovered that debt follows you regardless of geography. His wages were garnished, his bank accounts were frozen, and his options for avoiding responsibility were eliminated one by one. Eventually, he too returned to North Carolina and signed a repayment agreement, though his was structured differently due to his flight risk. His payments were deducted directly from his paycheck, and he was required to provide quarterly financial statements to ensure compliance. By the end of that first year, all 5 of my siblings had accepted formal repayment agreements and were making regular payments on their debts. The amounts varied based on their earning capacity, but each of them was contributing something towards satisfying their obligations. More importantly, they were all employed in positions they'd earned through their own efforts rather than family connections. Marcus had found work as an operations manager for a mid-sized manufacturing company, earning roughly half what he'd made at Franklin Industries, but learning skills he'd never had to develop before. Catherine was working as a retail coordinator for a department store chain, starting at the bottom and slowly proving her competence. Patricia had returned to school to become a certified public accountant, supporting herself through part-time work while studying for her licensing exams. David had taken a position with a construction company, using his engineering background in ways he'd never been challenged to do before. Even James, after his failed attempt at escape, had found steady work as a production supervisor at a textile mill. Their standard of living had changed dramatically. Gone were the expensive cars, the luxury vacations, the country club memberships, and the casual assumption that money would always be available when needed. They were living like middle-class working people, budgeting carefully, making choices based on necessity rather than desire. But something else had changed as well. For the first time in their adult lives, they were discovering what they were actually capable of achieving through their own efforts. They were learning skills they'd never needed to develop, solving problems they'd never been forced to face, and building self-respect through genuine accomplishment rather than inherited privilege. Marcus called me 6 months after signing his repayment agreement to tell me he'd been promoted to assistant plant manager. His voice carried a pride I'd never heard before, the satisfaction of someone who'd earned recognition through merit rather than family connections. "I wanted you to know," he said, "that I'm actually good at this. I'm good at managing operations, at solving production problems, at motivating employees. I never knew that before, because I never had to prove it." Catherine sent me a handwritten letter after her first year of employment, describing how she'd implemented a new inventory management system that had saved her employer significant money. She wrote that for the first time in her life she felt like she was contributing real value rather than just occupying a position someone else had created for her. Even James, despite his initial resistance, eventually acknowledged that the experience of rebuilding his life from scratch had taught him things about himself he'd never known. He'd discovered that he was capable of hard work when necessity demanded it, that he could solve his own problems when no one else was available to solve them for him. Franklin Industries continued to thrive during this period of family upheaval. In fact, the removal of my siblings from company operations had eliminated several sources of inefficiency and internal conflict that I hadn't fully recognized before. Department heads who'd previously had to navigate family politics could now focus entirely on business objectives. Strategic decisions could be made more quickly without having to accommodate 5 different egos and agendas. The company's financial performance actually improved during the year following the family restructuring. Revenue grew by 12%, profit margins increased, and employee satisfaction surveys showed higher scores than we'd achieved in previous years. The business press began referring to Franklin Industries as a model for how family businesses could successfully transition away from nepotistic management structures. I used some of the company's improved profitability to establish an employee profit-sharing program and to fund educational benefits for workers who wanted to develop additional skills. I also created a charitable foundation focused on supporting small business development in rural North Carolina, channeling the family's wealth toward purposes that would benefit the broader community. The loan payments from my siblings became a reliable source of funding for these philanthropic initiatives. Every month, their debt service contributed to scholarships for first-generation college students, microloans for minority-owned businesses, and community development projects in economically disadvantaged areas. There was a poetic justice in this arrangement that I found deeply satisfying. The money they'd borrowed to maintain their comfortable lifestyles was now being used to create opportunities for people who'd never had the advantages my siblings had taken for granted. 2 years after that confrontation in the boardroom, I received an unexpected phone call from Marcus. He was calling to tell me that he'd been offered a position as general manager of the manufacturing plant where he worked, a promotion that would more than double his salary and put him on track for eventual executive leadership. "I wanted to ask your advice," he said, "about whether I should accept the position. The increased income would let me accelerate my loan payments to you, but it would also mean taking on responsibilities I've never handled before." The fact that he was asking for my advice, rather than simply announcing his decision, represented a fundamental change in our relationship. He was approaching me as someone whose judgment he respected, rather than as an obstacle to his ambitions. "What do you think you should do?" I asked. "I think I should take the job," he said. "Not just because of the money, but because I want to find out what I'm capable of when I'm really challenged. For the first time in my life, I'm not afraid of failing, because I know I can handle whatever consequences come from trying." "Then you should take the job, even if it means I might fail?" "Especially if it means you might fail. You've learned more about yourself in the past 2 years than you learned in the previous 20. That's because you've been forced to face real challenges with real consequences. Don't stop that process now." Marcus accepted the promotion and proved to be exceptionally successful in his new role. Within 18 months, he'd increased the plant's productivity by 22% and had been recruited by 2 competing companies, offering even better opportunities. Similar conversations took place with each of my siblings over the following months. They were all discovering capabilities they'd never known they possessed, all building genuine self-confidence through earned achievements rather than inherited advantages. The family dinners we'd once shared became infrequent, but when they did occur, the dynamics were completely different. My siblings no longer approached me as dependents seeking support or as rivals competing for control. They came as equals who'd learned to respect both themselves and each other through their own accomplishments. Catherine brought her children to dinner one evening and spent the meal talking about the business degree she was pursuing through night school. Her teenagers listened with genuine interest as she described the challenges of balancing work, education, and family responsibilities. They were learning lessons about determination and self-reliance that they never would have absorbed if their mother had remained dependent on family wealth. Patricia announced at another dinner that she'd passed her CPA examination and had been offered a position with a respected accounting firm. The pride in her voice was unmistakable, and I realized I was seeing her genuine personality for the first time in years, unfiltered by the entitlement and resentment that had characterized her previous behavior. Even James, when he finally felt secure enough to attend a family gathering, had changed in fundamental ways. He spoke quietly about the gambling addiction that had driven many of his previous financial crises, and about the counseling program he'd joined to address the underlying issues that had made him vulnerable to destructive behaviors. "I never understood before," he said, "why I kept making the same mistakes over and over. I thought I was just unlucky, or that other people were better at managing money than I was. But it wasn't about luck or skill. It was about never having to face real consequences for my choices." During these conversations, I began to understand that the confrontation in the boardroom had been a catalyst for positive changes that went far beyond financial accountability. My siblings had been forced to examine their own character, their own capabilities, and their own responsibility for the direction of their lives. They'd discovered that they were stronger and more competent than they'd ever realized. But they'd also learned that strength and competence had to be earned through effort and demonstrated through results. The entitled, dependent adults who'd called me useless had evolved into self-reliant individuals who understood the value of hard work and personal integrity. The loan payments continued, and would continue for decades to come, but they were no longer a source of resentment or family conflict. They'd become a symbol of personal commitment, a monthly reminder of lessons learned and responsibilities accepted. Franklin Industries celebrated its most profitable year in company history, at the end of my 3rd year as sole family leadership. The celebration took place in the same ballroom where we'd held countless family events over the decades, but this time the guest list included not just family members, but also employees, community leaders, and business partners who'd contributed to our success. During my remarks to the assembled group, I spoke about the importance of accountability, both personal and professional. I talked about how organizations thrive when people take responsibility for their actions and accept the consequences of their choices. I discussed the value of earning success through merit rather than expecting it through inheritance. When I finished speaking, Marcus stood up and asked to address the group. I was curious about what he might say, but I nodded for him to proceed. 3 years ago, he began, my siblings and I made a terrible mistake. We convinced ourselves that our individual contributions to this company were more significant than they actually were, while simultaneously believing that our sister's leadership was less valuable than it clearly was. The room was completely silent as he continued. We approached Bessie with demands that she step aside and allow us to take control of the company our father had entrusted to her care. We justified these demands by telling ourselves, and her, that she was the most useless member of our family. I saw several people in the audience shift uncomfortably at his words, but Marcus pressed on. What we discovered through the consequences of that betrayal was that we were wrong about everything. Wrong about our own capabilities, wrong about our sister's contributions, and wrong about what it means to earn respect through genuine achievement. He looked directly at me as he spoke his final words. Bessie Franklin is not the most useless member of this family. She is the strongest, the most capable, and the most generous person any of us have ever known. She gave us the gift of accountability when we needed it most, even though it would have been easier for her to continue enabling our irresponsibility. The applause that followed was long and heartfelt, but more meaningful to me than the public recognition was the knowledge that my siblings had genuinely learned from their experience, that they'd grown into better people because they'd been forced to confront the truth about themselves. That night, as I sat in my study reviewing the financial reports that documented another year of record-breaking success, I thought about the letter my father had written in anticipation of this exact scenario. He'd predicted that his children would eventually reveal their true character through their actions, and he'd prepared legal mechanisms to ensure that both the company and the family would survive whatever crisis might arise. But Samuel Franklin had also predicted something else. That people could change when they were forced to face the consequences of their behavior, and that real love sometimes required allowing people to experience the full weight of their poor choices. My siblings had called me the most useless member of our family, and in response, I'd shown them exactly how useful I'd always been. I'd demonstrated the value of my leadership by removing it temporarily from their lives. I'd illustrated the importance of my financial support by withdrawing it completely. I'd proven my worth by forcing them to discover their own. In the end, the woman they'd dismissed as worthless had given them something more valuable than money or position or inherited privilege. I'd given them the opportunity to become the people our father had always hoped they could be. The loan payments would continue for decades, a monthly reminder of lessons learned and growth achieved. Franklin Industries would continue to thrive under leadership that had been tested by betrayal and strengthened by survival. And our family would continue to evolve, bound together not by dependence or entitlement, but by mutual respect earned through genuine accomplishment. 3 years after they'd voted me the most useless member of our family, I'd voted them into a new understanding of what family really means. Not a safety net that enables poor choices, but a foundation that supports growth, accountability, and the kind of love that demands people become their best selves. That was my story, and I told it exactly as it happened. Sometimes the people who hurt you most give you the greatest opportunity to discover who you really are. Sometimes being called worthless is the first step toward proving your true worth. And sometimes the best thing you can do for people you love is refuse to protect them from the consequences of their own actions. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.